Welcome, everyone. It's good to see so many people here. I'm Donna Roth. I volunteer on the program committee. Today, our presenter may look familiar to some of us. We knew her as Julia Berg. She was instrumental in getting us into Redfield campus, if some of you remember, and we had all those great programs down there. We no longer have any classes there. There's no room. And then Julia was also instrumental in starting the Day of Remembrance. Today's story is about Julia's family and how they saved a Jewish couple during World War II. Let's welcome Julia.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here at Ollie. I live in Berkeley now, so I don't get up here very often. But to see all these familiar faces is wonderful. And I hope you like my presentation about the book I wrote, Decency and Luck. What it really is, it's a story that I had to tell about the occupation of Germany in the Netherlands. And I'll say Holland all the time because Holland was the biggest state in the Netherlands, and how life changed in 1940 with the occupation. I wrote this, that their struggles and their accomplishments won't be forgotten. It could easily be. In World War I, the Netherlands was a neutral country. The country had expected to stay neutral when they saw a Second World War coming up. They stockpiled food and did other things to make sure that they could survive being a neutral country for a period of time. Because people knew that they were a neutral country, a lot of people immigrated to Holland right before the war. There were people like Anne Frank's family and the Krells. And I will tell you a little bit about the Krells. The people were smart in stockpiling, but they just didn't expect what happened next. On May 10th, a war was started because Hitler thought that the little country of Holland would certainly want to be part of Germany if they just persisted. They decided they would just take them in one fall swoop. And so they had all these parachuted come down, and they were dressed as nuns and workmen, and then they would blockade all the bridges and the roads that the people could not get in and out of Holland. And then they demanded from the government to surrender within 4 days. And if they did not surrender, they were going to bomb Rotterdam. Rotterdam was the largest port in Europe at that time, with a population of 1.5 million people. It is where my family have grown up that I could trace back to the 1400s. So we have a lot of knowledge of that area. And even though they signed the treaty, by the fourth day, Germany bombed Rotterdam anyway. There were a lot of deaths. 83,000 people no longer had homes. Udar Bar is a historian. After the war, he said there were 3 major commandments to take pride in yourself and in your country. The first thing was not to be a victim. The second thing was not to be a perpetrator. And the third was, above all, not to be a bystander. Those are easy words to say, but they're not easy words to do. During the occupation, they had to follow strict rules. There were things like curfews and German identification cards that you had to have. And then when you went on the streets, you could still be accosted by soldiers. And so my parents knew that you had to walk around with self-confidence and purpose, meaning walking quickly, not slowly, to avoid having contact with soldiers as much as possible, and to also show that you were not afraid, even though you might have been shaking in your bones. They also had to be silent about many things that they did, so very silent, not only to their children, but also to their relatives and friends and everybody that they knew, because their lives were at risk if they were not silent about a lot of things that they did. And children are very easy to manipulate, to spill the beans. So you had to be careful what you said around your children. It also meant hiding things that were supposed to be confiscated. They hid the things that could mean the difference between life and death. One of the things I just want you to think about is what would happen if an area like the San Francisco Bay Area got bombed? Would you be able to survive that? Well, what about Reno? Reno is where all the transportation crosses roads for northern United States. It is at a very vulnerable point. It's where I-80 and the major train stations are. If they are bombed, what could you do as a family? We had a little experience of government control when we had COVID. Think about what would happen if you also had to have this additional burden of trying to survive. It's just something that I want you to think about and learn from some of the things my parents did to make sure that you could follow some of these rules for survival. One of the things the Germans did is they confiscated goods. And the first thing they confiscated was all the stockpiled food. They said, oh, just leave enough food for 6 months. By that time, they're going to be part of Germany, so it won't make any difference anyway. Of course, that wasn't what actually happened. And in the meantime, we're going to give you ration cards that everybody will get an equal portion in your food. We're going to allow 1,500 calories per day per person. That was at the beginning of the war. At the end of the war, it was 500 calories per day per person if they happened to have the food. And in the winter of 44 and 45, there was no food to be had. The trains weren't running. No boats were coming in because of blockades. All the roads were closed. There just wasn't any food. And my mother remembers people dying on the street. My dad said that if the war had lasted another 6 months, there wouldn't be one person alive in the Netherlands. The Germans confiscated also valuables like jewelry, gold, silver, and copper. They said it was for the war effort. Well, of course, they had to pay for the guns and all the things that they were doing. But I'm sure some of it went into the soldiers' pockets too. The next thing they wanted to do is get rid of all the radios because they didn't want you to listen to radio broadcasts from other countries that actually learn what was going on. They wanted to give you propaganda newspapers that you could read, and that was all that you had available to you. So the smart people gave the soldiers the old radio and kept the best radio for themselves and hid it, that they would be able to get a weekly report from the Queen of Holland from England, where she was located at the time. The other thing that they collected was bicycles and tires. I don't know if you've ever been in the Netherlands, but you'll notice that that is a country that runs on bicycles because it's a flat land, it's easy to use, easy to store, cheap, so it's good transportation. Well, in this case, they wanted the soldiers to be able to ride all the bicycles. So they confiscated the bicycles, but then they wanted to confiscate all the rubber tires also. So if you happen to have a bicycle, more than likely it was without a rubber tire. And my dad remembers at one point he had to take one of these bicycles and take a fur coat all the way out to some farmland to exchange a fur coat for a bag of peas. And then he took half the bag of peas and bartered for wood. And he said he was more afraid of bringing the food back on the bicycle through the little polders roadways than he was going there. But coming back with the food, he was afraid that something could happen to him. But he made it. They also sold blankets and other goods. So you were without anything and you really couldn't complain. If you complained, they made threats of killing people, and they did kill people. They killed a lot of people after curfew. In 1940, my parents had to set up a safety program of our household. What they did is they took my sister Johanna, who was very bright, and my brother Jack, who was only 4 years old, and sent them out on the street. And we lived on a curvy street that was just like an S. And there was a tobacco store at the top. And so a lot of soldiers were at the tobacco store. But if the soldiers came wandering in the back or when they were trying to confiscate things, my sisters would run into the house, tell my mom, And my mom would line up all the children by the front door. And when the soldiers got nearby, she used to pinch them really hard. Now remember, this is a person who needed dough and had a lot of strong hand muscle coordinations. If she pinch you hard, you're going to cry, right? So the soldiers really kind of avoided our door because they really didn't want to go into a house with crying children. That was another safety thing that my parents did. And in 1942 was when all the Jews were reported to go east. We knew from that that the people that did go there never came back, and they never wrote any letters or anything. So we knew it was much more serious than just trying to find a new home. The propaganda said, oh, this is the land of honey. You can find jobs there and you can find food there. You just pay for your ticket to go east and you'll find work there. And that was the propaganda. But what actually happened in Holland, which is a little different than other countries, they didn't have a ghetto to put the people in. What they had was Camp Westerbroek. Camp Westerbroek was a resort that was built by a Jewish organization. In that, they had all these houses and buildings, and so the Germans just took it over. And this is where all the Dutch Jews were taken to until the trains that took them to death camps. And there was a pecking order as to which people went to the death camps first. In 1943, the Germans hadn't done enough damage yet. What they wanted to do was conscribe all the male adults 18 through 40 and tell them they had to go and work in Germany or work for soldiers. If they worked for Germany, they could do the building of guns and so forth, and that would free up some of the males that were doing that work, and those males could then be new soldiers for the German army. They went around the neighborhood and announced, all males between the ages of 18 and 40 come out. If you don't come out before we search your premises and find you in the premise, we will kill your whole family. And they did. One of the people that were affected by this conscription was my uncle, Hank. He was taking care of his mother, or the mother of 7, and Hank went out for the prescription, and he ended up in Germany in a bullet factory. My grandmother came to live with my mom and dad after that because there was no one there to take care of her, and she had arthritis really, really bad. This is what the identification card looks like that you had to have that if you were German. It had a picture and a thumbprint. The picture could easily be removed. It was between 2 pieces of paper and another picture put in that you could make false identification papers, but the thumbprint could not. If you could not match the thumbprint, you could not apply for ration cards. This is what the ration cards looked like and how they were in the various stores, long lines. And if you notice closely, all the ration cards were in German. There were additional rules applied to Jews. So everything I just told you is applied to every citizen in the Netherlands. But additionally, these are the rules that were applied to Jews. First, they had to wear a yellow star. Then they couldn't go on transportation, no buses, no trains, no telephones, and no education for their children. And if they happened to be a teacher or a professor, they were fired. They couldn't own a business, not a little shop. They couldn't be a doctor. Every Jew lost their jobs. And if you had a bank account, they saved $50 for you. And $50 when you had no job and no prospect of income is a pretty small sum. And later, when people started going east, there were households that were empty, and they started putting Germans in those empty households. They could go and get food with the money they had, but they only could go to the store between 5 and 6 when all the food was gone. And they had to pay for their own train tickets east, and they had to only have 1 suitcase. I think this was supposed to be a propaganda item to say, hey, if you pay for your ticket, you have some hope of a job in the future. If you take a suitcase, you have some possessions that you could take with you. But none of that actually occurred. all these people that went east in Holland went to Camp Westerville. And from there, they were trained to the various death camps. This is the Yellow Star, some of the things they did to businesses. And they demeaned the Jews by making them wash sidewalks and so forth. And they laughed at them. And if they didn't do what they were told, they were shot. This identification card on the side has a big J, meaning that they were Jewish. Thou shalt not be a perpetrator. What my parents did is they were very careful in talking to anyone, because later on, food became a main source of concern. And Nazi soldier could say, well, I'll give you a loaf of bread if you tell me of a Jew that's in your neighborhood that nobody knows about. Well, I'll give you a pound of sugar. And sometimes it was such a temptation that it actually happened. The Germans would just kill people if they did not stick to the rules. What my parents did, when we had Emmy and Leo come and live with us, the Jewish couple, they told my father's relatives that it was a cousin of my mother. They told my mother's family it was a brother of my father's. To the neighbors, they said, this is family that was living in Rotterdam during the bombing, and they were displaced housing people. And the other thing they did is they made a hole in the ground under the kitchen cupboard where they could hide in the case of the German conscription. And remember, we had my sister and my brother guarding and telling when the soldiers would come, that would give us a little warning as to when they needed to hide. So those are some of the things that happened. Thou shalt not be a bystander. Well, they weren't a bystander in the fact that they helped Emmy and Leo, the Jewish couple. They didn't believe in the propaganda, and they did have a radio that they had saved, that they could hear the Queen's message once a week. And they also depended on gut feeling. I'll tell you one story. It's about Leo. He had a bad toothache. He went to the dentist and he made an appointment to have his tooth removed. And the day of his appointment, he went to the dentist and walked right past the door and kept on going. And they found out later that a Nazi soldier was waiting in the dentist's office for him. It was his gut feeling that helped him survive that day. And that's the thing that you had to rely on a lot. And then you can also help people if you possibly can. I know my mother, at the beginning of the war, gave a plate of food to a neighbor off and on. And that little plate of food had to be spread among 4 people in that neighbor's house. They didn't ask for help, not from the underground, not from churches, not from any organization that they knew. They kept to themselves because they didn't want to be exposed to any traitors. And you think about how isolated you are. You can't talk to others, you can't ask for help. You have to be self-reliant the whole time and do the best you can. The one outstanding feature between my father and Leo is that they both had the same occupation. They were furriers. My father worked in a store like Nordstrom's, and they made custom-made fur coats. Leo was an ordnance officer in the Dutch service. And of course, when the war started, he lost his job. So he had to go back to his family industry, which was being a furrier. But where could he get the fur? So he went to my father and he asked if he could have the scraps of fur that they didn't use anymore. And my father went to his supervisor and said, could I get the scraps of fur to Leo? Turned out the supervisor was also Jewish and sympathetic and said, yes, sure, give him all the fur scraps you want. My dad and Leo got together frequently and talked. They talked about fur coat styles, different things. And eventually, my dad sold some of Leo's fur coats at the store at discounted rates, but they weren't in very modern style. So my dad then gave him some patterns to make better fur coats they could sell for higher prices. Those were the kinds of give and takes that they had and the kind of communications that they had. This is the kind of fur coats that they were made in the time, and fur blankets. My mom is in the light colored fur coat and Emmy is in the dark fur coat on the top left photo. Then Leo received a letter on August 18th, 1942. This is a copy of that letter. He knew that everyone that went to the east would die. They were served as slaves, but they came to our house instead. We lived at 23 McWellstraat, The Hague. It was a 3-bedroom house that had an attic. Half the attic was used for Emmy and Leo, and the other half was used to make fur coats that they sold on the black market to make up for the shortage of food. This is what they did to make them passable as brothers. In the top photos, you'll see Leo and my dad before the war. When they started living in the same house, they went to the same barber, the same eye maker, and the same tailor, that they looked alike even though they weren't alike. And then they were free to walk around and gather fur and sell fur and make money and be careful with what they did. The other thing that was a little trick is by being out and walking, you would get a little bit of a tan. People that were hidden didn't have a tan. So it was a signal to the Germans. If you were very pale, you were being hidden. So now we had all these people living in our home. Think about 11 people in a 3-bedroom house and cooking for that number of people every day. This is a picture of Emmy and Leo when they were first married. But what happened to their son? Their son was only 1 year old at the time. My dad said they couldn't come and live with us because Robert, even a year old, didn't look like the rest of us oversleuths. He wasn't a towhead. He had curly black hair. He was cute as cute can be, but he didn't look like one of my siblings. And so it would have been a signal to the Germans that we were hiding some people. So what Emmy and Leo did when they got their notice to move east is they asked the neighbor to take care of Robert. And the neighbor did take care of Robert. But a couple of months in, they were told they had to move and they were willing to take Robert with them. But Emmy and Leo said, no, we want him to stay in The Hague. Another couple came that were dear friends of the couple that was taking care of Robert. And their names were Let and Albert Munich. And they had a 12-year-old daughter. They said, we'll take him. I always wanted a son for a little while. And so he was treated very well. But he remembers his dad coming to visit him and saying, don't call me dad. You call me uncle. You call Let and Albert mom and dad, that other people won't be suspicious. He had the feeling that if he did something wrong or got ill, he might not have a home. So he was a scared child. He couldn't look out the windows, but Nora was wonderful. Nora, the 12-year-old, kept him busy and taught him to read at the age of 3. And he was a bright boy and he did very well. This is after the war. This is a picture of my mom and dad on vacation, actually, in France. After the war, our family did quite well, and everybody came home, including Hank. Hank came back from Germany by hiding under a train and coming through the border. How he survived, I don't know, but he did. Emmy and Leo were lucky to have their son. It was destiny that they had their son, but their families were gone. And Leo went searching with a truck all over Holland to try to find relatives. He had 2 sisters that were in the area and they had children. He found 1 nephew and 1 niece. And that nephew wanted to stay with the family that he had been with. And so Leo accepted that. But the niece came and lived with Emmy and Leo for a while after the war. My father found a shop that they could buy and make into a furrier business. On the 2nd floor was a little apartment, and that is where Emmy and Leo lived after the war with Robert. But Robert remembers sitting under the table, and his cousin, who spoke Yiddish and other languages, would tell him the stories of other Holocaust survivors that came to the house to see if they could find family. These stories affected him greatly. He was only 5 years old. He never forgot. This is the pictures of my siblings in the 1940s, and then actually the lower pictures right before we came to America. Jeanette, Johanna, Jack, and my baby sister, Jenny. In the lower picture, the child with a white fur cap is me. I was born right after the war, so I was the only one that wasn't affected by the war. Both Emmy and Leo wanted to get visas to America. When Leo got his visa, he gave it to my dad, that my dad was the first person to immigrate to the United States, and he came in 1950. That left Leo and family still in Holland trying to immigrate. And they immigrating the next year to Canada, where they had a distant relative. So we were on the same side of the continent at least, but miles away. We had to go to a warmer climate because my sister was ill the whole time during the war, and they had to get her to a warmer climate. Otherwise, they said she wouldn't live past the age of 12. Today, she is 83. All my other siblings have died, and so the outcome was correct. In 1975, my parents were honored with the Righteous Medal. Even though my mom had passed away by then, my dad received a medal from the ambassador of Israel and Holland in Beverly Hills. The back of this medal in French says, "He who saves one life saves the world." The Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem, Israel, was established in 1946 as a tribute to all the dead during the Holocaust. The Yad Vashem also honored the righteous Gentiles by giving them this medal. To be a righteous Gentile, you had to be one of the people that was non-Jew that helped the Jew to survive the slaughter of the Jewish people, and then they bestowed the medal on them. These people who got the medal risked their lives and that of their families and others. Here, my brother is giving the medal to Robert. I've forgotten what year it was, but it was the first day of remembrance that Ollie had at the university, and it was held in the highest floor. And Robert came out and spoke to everyone on that day of remembrance. He is a very elegant speaker. And so my brother gave Robert the medal to put in his Vancouver Holocaust Educational Center. That educational center has 20,000 teenage children come through once a year to learn about discrimination and prejudice. Today, Robert is 83. He just donated 500 books, papers, and other items to the educational center. And he has written many, many books. He has edited many books. He has traveled all over the world speaking, especially about the hidden children. He has started groups for the hidden children to get together that they can go beyond what they think they knew. A lot of people think they are so young that they really didn't know where they came from, what their names were, and they have all of this hanging over their head. And Robert, as a psychiatrist, helped put these groups together and allowed them to heal through some of that sorrow. I've been telling you a lot of unhappy stuff, but this is a happy photo. This is Robert's graduation in 1965 from medical school. It not only had Robert and his mom and dad. His mom is in the pink, his dad is next to him. And my dad is right next to Robert, about a head taller. And my mother is in the blue outfit. And on the end is Let and Albert. Let and Albert are Robert's second parents. He will joke. He is the only Jewish doctor that had his Christian parents tell him to become a doctor. This is a visit that I went to see Robert with my sister Jenny. So I'm in the red, she's in the blue. We're sitting on the couch. He has 4 wonderful children, girls. They all marry wonderful men. I think there's up to 6 grandchildren now. And Robert will be the first to say, Hitler failed. Here, I have a Jewish family. He was not able to kill all the Jews. It's amazing what people can do when they're put to the test. Try to remember not to be a victim or perpetrator or a bystander as you lived your life. These are important things for yourself and for a country. I thank you very much and ask you if you have any questions. Yes,
Why did Hitler pick out the Jews as victims?
because everybody were brainwashed for 3,000 years that Jews were the cause of all their problems. For 3,000 years, this discrimination has been going on. Yes,
You talked a little bit about forgery and
yes,
how you couldn't do the thumbprint. Were Leo and his wife able to get a ration card?
no. They were able to get forged identification, but not a ration card because their thumbprint didn't work. I interviewed 3 people that were Holocaust survivors in Reno, and I can tell you a short synopsis of their stories. The first one is Kempler. Joe Kempler, at age 16, was blonde and blue-eyed, and he was in a death camp. And one of the worst jobs he had was for 30 days, barefoot. He had to climb 80 steps with a 50-pound stone on his back. He's a Holocaust survivor who lived in Reno for quite a few years. Mika Kalinsky, age 5, was taken from the death camp by a German sergeant. They put him on his farm and told him to take care of the animals, and he could eat and sleep with the animals. He never learned to read or write, and he did not know he was free until 3 years after the war. He still lives in Sparks, Nevada. William Winhook, age 25, a Christian, forged German documents and was held as a political prisoner. He was treated just a little bit better than everyone else there. His saving grace is that he handed out the uniforms to the people there. He was a retired economics professor at UNR. And I asked him why he never married. And he said, I learned I could never trust anyone. So those are just a few little quirks. More questions? Yes.
Your parents took care of these other 2 people for how many years?
In 1942, they were told they had to show up to go to the east. So it was from there to the end of the war.
They were in jeopardy of being killed if they found out them doing this.
Not only them, but the children.
How did they conquer their fear, or how did they live day by day? What were their thoughts?
Well, they had a strong belief in God and that this was their purpose. And I think that carried them through to a lot of things. But also, my father was the main breadwinner at 11 years old for a family of 7. And my mother, at age 14, was considered adult, and she was a master seamstress. Very young ages, they learned the lessons of life.
Well, let's thank Julia.